Agora podemos. Good morning, everybody. So we'll start now our second day of conference. I hope you have enjoyed yesterday. So we'll have now more academic sessions in those 2 days, today and tomorrow. I'd like to stress that although this is called the first annual conference of the Central Bank of Brazil, actually we start having this kind of conference when we implemented inflation target in Brazil. So it was the inflation target conference. I think it was the only conference in the world whose name had inflation targeting. And later on, we start having the conference on financial stability and banking. With the pandemic, we didn't have the conference for 3 years. And we decided to unify those 2 conferences in just one. We believe that this makes the conference stronger and somehow recognize the broadness of the different areas of central banking, as we saw yesterday, for example, with Class's presentation. So the idea of having one conference also recognize that. Today, tomorrow, we'll have the presentation and discussion of 37 papers. We were pleased that we had 269 submissions to this event. So it was a hard work to choose the papers. I haven't participated in the choice, so you don't need to thank me. But Angelo was responsible for the evaluation of the papers in the area of macroeconomics, and Sergio Koyama was responsible for the evaluation of the papers in financial stability and banking. So now we have 2 groups of parallel sessions. We try to arrange the sessions by topics, but I would say the sessions A, they are more focused on macroeconomics. We have sessions on monetary policy, labor markets, expectations, modeling, and international economy. In the case of sessions B, we'll have the topics of banking, digital currency, climate change, and financial inclusion. These sessions A will be held in this auditorium, and sessions B will be held in the other auditorium. So after this introduction, people that want to participate in sessions B should go to the other auditorium. I'd like to thank especially for the people that came from abroad. So we have 27 people from abroad, and thank you very much for taking long flights to get here. And it seems that not only there is some discussion if Brazil is attractive or not. It seems that's not that bad because we have so many submissions, and I hope you have the opportunity of getting around in Brasilia, that of course has a unique architecture. So now I'll give the floor to Angelo and Sergio Miquel Koyama. They are deputy heads of the research department and worked very hard to have this conference in place. I would say they worked much more than me, okay? And just one second. I don't know if I have realized, we have a carry code in the budget that you can access the program, the schedule of the conference, okay? If you did, you can try to do that, okay? Angelo, please.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank again, Andrea did it, but I'd like to thank you personally for coming to this conference. I think it's a great opportunity to, again, started to see everybody again after a few years that we lost the conference due to the pandemic. As Andrea said, I was responsible for choosing the papers in the macro field, and again, because of the conference, we see some significant changes in terms of the topics that we are actually covering during this conference. We used to have basically a whole bunch of papers discussing bells and whistles from structural models, mostly designed for central banks. Now we're going to have a lot of papers actually with still dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, but now more related to heterogeneous agents. We're going to have one entire session devoted to that, and also several other papers spread around the sessions discussing those type of models, or at least using those models to discuss some relevant issues on macroeconomics. Also, I think the macroeconomic side has changed a little bit, trying to use more technical details from microeconomics. I mean, using micro data, pricing data sets, very detailed data sets in order to match the issues with pricing and expectations. So we're going to have pretty much a full set of papers on that. And also, as we are an emerging economy, that by itself, it's a relevant topic for us. But I think after the pandemic, it became really important, a session on the foreign transmission of shocks, which is a relevant issue, I guess, now for the whole world. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for submitting your papers. It's a great pleasure to see new faces, old faces that used to come to the inflation targeting seminar, and also the old faces that basically we stopped seeing here at the central bank since we started home office, and now we can see a bunch of people here back together. So thanks everyone. Hope you enjoy it. Sergio.
Okay. Thank you very much. After 2 years without the seminar of inflation target and financial stability and bank economics, we are very honored with the presence of everyone in this first annual conference. The option of the parallel sections are meant to serve the public of these 2 seminars and promote interaction between these 2 areas. By the way, since 2013, we have been working to facilitate joint working by research from the central bank and academy and other international bodies and central banks in order to increase the exchange of experience. Currently, the infrastructure setup has allowed to realize the several partners that have resulted in several joint research, some of which will be present in this conference. Naturally, those who attribute the quality of the conference are not us for the organization, but you who favor us with your participation today and tomorrow. And for that, we are very grateful. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all my colleagues of the Central Bank who work hard to make this event a reality. And to all, thank you very much and have a good event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It was found a hotel key here. Maybe we should check. Otherwise, I'll use this to steal something in the hotel. And now I think you should, the guys that are going to participate in sessions B, I invite you to go to the other auditorium. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Você clica ali.
Beleza. O Euler, que é o moderador, né?
Eu vou esperar ele. Ah, ele está chegando.
Está chegando aqui.
Você vai qual? Você está dedão?
Não, não sou moderador nenhum. Nada. É justamente por isso.
Euler. Deixa eu mostrar. Mostrar. Você vai moderar só ela? Tá aqui a pasta. Eu pus um A de... Esse aqui não tem, só pra sacanagem. O D é de debatedor, o A de apresentador. Mas está na hora. Está na hora. Mas assim... Aqui é o seu...
Vamos chegar aí.
Uhum. Você se identifica para ajudar ela.
Esse aqui é o...
Euler.
Ele é o Euler. Acho que sentado é melhor. Gosta de andar? Então... Deixa eu ver se... O microfone não vai pegar, né?
Tá ligado. E aí... você queria um microfone de mão?
Cara, podia jogar no final.
Drop the mic. Aqui é o American Got Talent,
Lá em Richmond a gente tem aquela gelatela do pessoal brasileiro. Não, mas tudo bem, já estou sabendo como é que eu tinha.
Ela foi interessada, porque ele comentou que pode ser interessante.
Detalhe, a gente vai
pode fazer com de mão.
Bom de estar lá, em todo caso, eu consigo ver a tela. Era aqui eu estou de fora.
Tranquilo, tem clicker aqui. Ele vai passar.
Tem aqui também, para ver.
Deixa eu posso abrir aí. Você que apresenta?
Eu que apresento primeiro.
Vou abrir a sua só para ver.
Legal.
Ele ver como é que fica. Ops, deu algo errado, porque ela não... Eu acho que já era lá. Eu sei. Mas a de lá perdeu.
Tá no canto aqui, não?
Não, mas já devia estar replicado. Não estou vendo ali. Pronto. Estamos com o Axon. Axon ou Breno.
Só pode sentar mais perto, né?
Eu vou tentar estender, mas agora...
É mais perto. Libera aí, cara.
Ela já está duplicada. Ótimo que foi hoje, né?
Pois é, não foi ontem.
Breno, a tela daqui sumiu.
Bom, como é que tá?
Tá só como DIV eventos. Deixa eu ver o Breno. Não está replicando a...
Gente, então. É um Q&A. Tá bom. Tá bom. Vai tentar, na verdade, fazer a resposta. Tem algum feedback? Tu tem Apolon? Perfeito. Perfeito. Aí a gente vai ajustando. Tá ótimo. A gente vai ajustando.
Não, tudo bem.
Minha apresentação eu parei para 15. Eu apresentei num lugar que era 15, então eu vou até esticar um pouquinho. A discussão não sei, mas vamos ver.
Não é o Ctrl L? Mas não foi para lá. Aquela tela.
Tá.
Começar a parar. Atualizar, a gente depois libera no site.
Tá, beleza. Então não vai ter a apresentação.
Está 100% na gravação.
Eventualmente
Aqui
falar.
pequeno.
Tem a apresentação ali.
Tá.
Ali, ó. A transmissão. A gravação.
Olha, só um minuto. Eu vou fazer lá, você fica aqui só para dar sinal para mim que chegou, beleza?
É porque é o seguinte, porque o cara tá aqui, ó, ele vê o slide lá.
Tá, então ele vai fazer a mudança agora.
Obrigado. Tem como falar para o...
Well, I guess we could start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, it's a pleasure to have you all here. To this section on monetary policy transmission, we are To make sure everything will run smoothly, I'm just gonna say the rules of the game. So every presenter will have 20 minutes, then the discussion 10. After we've presented all the 3 papers, then we're gonna open for the audience and have some Q&A, okay? Without further ado, I would like to invite Angelo to present his paper on Brazilian macroeconomic dynamics redux, shocks, frictions, and unemployment in Samba model. Angelo, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Pleasure to see, again, as I said, a lot of familiar faces around here. This is a paper that was pretty much very long overdue. I think, okay, first of all, let me start with the usual disclaimer. Everything that I say here is my opinion, absolutely not related to any of the opinions that the Banco Central do Brasil provides from at his documents or their opinions. So everything that I say here, it's my fault or either the fault of the co-authors that I'm seeing over there. So just here to replicate what we all discussed throughout these years. So as I was starting to say, this is a long overdue paper. What I'm going to present here is pretty much the update from the DSG model of Banco Central do Brasil. Here I put quotes on saying that it's the official DSG model of Banco Central do Brasil, because of course, if you take a look at the working paper series, we had several other papers, other DSG papers with different uses here at the central bank, but the one that sort of became famous is the one that we had the opportunity to update here. The first version of this paper was actually published in the working papers in 2011, later published in 2015, so I guess it's more than time to update it. So in this presentation, due to time constraints, I will spend like a very small amount of time actually presenting what we changed in the structure of the model. I will spend a lot of time trying to discuss some issues on data and estimation procedures. That's what I think we had the most important changes in our model, and a few results, mostly based on impulse response functions, but the paper itself has a lot of other results that you can check it out. So this is basically the outline of the presentation I just talked. What really happened? What is actually the model, and what we kept in this version of the model here? So it's still a multi-sector economy in the sense that you have explicit description of pricing for all the components of the aggregate demand, and inside the consumption prices we have an additional layer of pricing, separating what we call free prices and monitor prices. Monitor prices are those prices somehow controlled by the government. So it's still a multi-sector economy. It's still a model where production takes a multi-stage process, because we have the aggregation of domestic inputs. Those inputs are aggregated with foreign inputs, and then you generate the final production good. And still have some adaptation to the Brazilian economy. So as I mentioned, the split between free and monitor prices, a fiscal policy framework in this model based on targets for the primary results, and a distinctive characteristic of Brazil, due to the significant share in imports. We have these imports as an input for domestic production. For those who are not from Brazil, basically around 70% of Brazilian imports are basically inputs for domestic production. So that's why we think it's an important issue in our model. But where did the model actually change? I mean, due to basically data, adapting the model to data, getting the model to fit the data, we decided to implement a framework for characterize unemployment. So Galiz, Metz, and Walters was a natural option. First, because it's a benchmark. I think a lot of other models in this literature adopt the Galiz, Metz, and Walters framework, but also because we comprise a small number of equations. We add a small number of equations in a already large model without compromising the whole structure of the economy. In terms of the foreign sector, we replaced the AR1 process that we had as exogenous shocks for foreign shocks, and I will show later some of the consequence of replacing it with a structural VAR. We had small changes in imports. Now in the previous version, imports only was used as an input for domestic production. Now we have sales. Now households can directly buy imported goods, and we introduced distortionary taxation in fiscal policy. This is the general overview of what changed in the model. So we highlight in the orange parts what actually changed, and we have in the upper left side where the Galiz, Metz, and Walters structure affect the model. That's basically the household description of the economy. We had on the right side imports of consumption goods. That's where the imports of those goods match with the domestic production of consumption goods. And we highlight also the distortionary taxation and the foreign sector in the VAR. So another issue that we slightly changed and is sort of unconventional in other models is the description of our Taylor rule. The Taylor rule in the model, the conventional part is still there. So there's a deviation from expected inflation from the inflation target. Also, output growth matters. But what really we think it's important is the description of the evolution of the inflation target itself. I mean, before we had a conventional AR1 process, what we did right now is to basically input time series and an explicit process for anticipated announcements of changes in the inflation target. So we had a sequence, as we can see in the last equation. Let me see if the pointer is actually working. No, it's not. Please, thank you. So as we can see in the last equation, we have a sequence of shocks describing the evolution of the inflation target. Those are pre-announced shocks. So basically, we can pretty much map the effects on the economy of actually changing today the inflation target that will start prevailing in future periods. And we have that lag structure just because that's the history in Brazil of changing the inflation target. So we had to map pretty much over time. Here's just a brief description of the structural VAR. We have sign restrictions to identify, to provide some structural flavor to the VAR. So that's where the model actually changed. In terms of data, we expanded in a few dimensions the data set. We have a total of 30 series to estimate the model. Our sample starts in 2001 Q4, ends in 2019 Q4. We still didn't have the guts to extend the sample to the COVID period. We think that might be very, very messy, so we are still taking a little bit slower on that. Brazil had changed the survey for unemployment, so we had to work on retropolation of data to compute information before 2012 from labor market, and that's a previous work from Sergio Alves and myself with mixed frequency VAR models. We add inflation expectations from the Focus survey. That's a recent trend on DSG models from other central banks to somehow incorporate information from surveys. But there's one critical component that we add to the model, which is an explicit measure of the output gap. Why are you adding the output gap? I think that's a natural question. And I guess I can show you why based on this graph. This graph, we show the evolution of GDP and GDP components over time in Brazil, starting at log base 100 in 2001 Q4. Our major issue here is that once we put all these data in the model, we can basically see that we have different trends for different components of GDP, where basically they were supposed to grow in a balanced growth path at the same rate over time. And not only they do not grow at the same rate or approximately at the same rate over time, we had this significant break after 2015, where basically there was a sort of a level shift, and then they start growing again at different rates again. So all these messy features basically said, okay, if we put all this data together and somehow do not impose some discipline on the evolution of productivity, that is the underlying process driving at least this trend, we're going to be in trouble. So why are we adding once we add the output gap, as you can see in the first two equations here, we inform output growth and we inform a measure of the output gap. We are implicitly saying that we are providing information about the evolution of productivity, right? If we replace one equation in the other in terms of observable, we are implicitly making assumptions about the evolution of domestic productivity plus a measurement error that is added to the output gap equation. The estimation of the productivity, I think it's important because we use this modified HP filter proposed in 2013, where basically the three equations describing the evolution of productivity exactly match the evolution of productivity incorporated in the structural model. So we basically use a modified HP filter where the description of the evolution of productivity matches exactly what's in the structural model. So that's why we think it was interesting to incorporate this measure of output gap. Now moving to the estimation, we have incorporated, that's where we actually changed a lot the process. So we start first discussing what we call the prior setting for the model. We have, of course, the conventional priors, which estimate this model, a bunch of measurement errors because of the number of observed variables. But we also incorporate a lot of what is known in the literature as the system priors. This literature came from Del Negro and Shorfhide, 2008, Underlay, 2016. Also, there are some other papers. I'd like to just provide a brief example what exactly we mean by system prior. So let's say that we have this production function that we would like to estimate the two main parameters. We have alpha and epsilon d. Those are the two main parameters of this production function. One natural way would be, okay, I'll take alpha from the other data sets, for instance, annual data sets where we can compute labor and capital share. But however, if we have a CES production function, the labor and capital share depends on epsilon d. So how do we put like everything together? If we had a Cobb-Douglas, just alpha was enough. If we have we are in trouble. So what do we do here? Well, we basically set a prior. We compute what would be the steady state of the capital share for the economy, set a flat prior for alpha and epsilon d, and establish a prior on the distribution of the moment that we have in steady state, which is the average capital share in Brazil. So we allow the model, we allow the estimation process to fluctuate these two parameters around a very flat region of the likelihood, but in order to somehow track the steady state of the capital share of the economy, instead of specifying specific priors for these two parameters. So I'm bringing extra layer of outside information to the model in order to set the priors. So other system priors, as I mentioned, we had the capital share. We also had the trade balance output ratio in terms of prior. On exogenous shocks, there's a whole discussion on how to set these priors in Del Negro and Scharf-Hyde. We implemented these priors here. Another relevant prior for our model, and here I'm showing the priors and the posterior, actually, of this moment of the model, is the impulse response functions after a monetary policy shock. I mean, we can basically put moments, impulse response functions are pretty much a moment derived from the model. So one of the issues is that we had with the model was the very sensitive response that we used to have from prices after a monetary policy shock. So we decided to put some discipline on that. How do we do that? Well, we had several models here at the central bank. They all provide a different measure of the impact of monetary policy shock. So what we did, we take a distribution of, that's the red bars in the figure that you are seeing. The red bars are pretty much a distribution of those shocks, of those moments in those other models of the central bank on impact after 4 periods and in the long run. So what we are basically imposing for the impulse response function of a monetary policy shocks is a description of the current impact that we think was very sensitive issue in the model, the maximum impact after 4 periods, and the long run impact, just saying, okay, we don't want monetary policy shocks to have a very persistent effect over time. And as you can see, we have the distribution of the posterior of the model in the IRF of the impulse response function. And as we can see, there is some extra information that the model provides in terms of these moments. So we're not actually constraining a lot the model from this perspective. Here we can see, due to the time I will skip it, but the effect of the system priors compared to the baseline priors, with the lines of each parameters is the baseline priors. As we can see from the gray areas, the system priors basically compress the domain of the functions to some relevant areas, and the green bars are the posterior distribution for these parameters. We changed the estimation process. We used to work with Metropolis Hastings algorithm, but the function is incredibly complex to derive moments from the posterior. We moved to a sequential Monte Carlo method, especially described in the paper from the New York Fed, where we use bridge distributions in order to match moments from the posterior. Main advantage is parallel implementation, so it's fast, it's useful, and it allows a better evaluation of the uncertainty of the model once we have all the moments of the distribution. So as we can see here, we have a 3D plot from 2 parameters of the model, and here we can see clearly that we have 2 modes in one of the dimensions of this parameter, and once we have this proper algorithm to evaluate the posterior, we can have a better assessment of the uncertainty regarding these moments. This assessment of uncertainty was very helpful in the monetary policy framework, monetary policy evaluation of the responses of the model. As we can see in the lower right panel, we have a huge uncertainty of the response of investment after a monetary policy shock. That's pretty much a result of the distribution of what we had here, reflecting on investment. The impulse response shock to monetary policy is very, the response of inflation is very similar to other models, especially the New York Fed model and the ECB model. And there's this whole discussion about the slope of the Phillips curve. So if we have a similar result in terms of the Phillips curve, but then we take what would be the estimation of the slope of the Phillips curve, and the Phillips curve that we estimate here is significantly more, the Phillips curve here is significantly more inclined compared to red line, the ECB model, and the dark shaded area in the left, the DSG model of the Fed New York. How can you reconcile that? I mean, we have the slope, but the response at the end of the day is pretty much the same. And then we have a bunch of stories that is in the Brazilian literature about the monetary policy transmission mechanism that is somehow that has some trouble in terms of getting to credit and from credit to the economic activity. So it's basically an issue of the slope of the IS curve instead of the slope of the Phillips curve here in Brazil, but you can check the discussion in paper, as Euler is telling me that my time is almost up. We have here just a brief overview of foreign shocks, which allows the model now in the current version allow a deeper discussion in terms of the effect of foreign shocks. We have the monetary policy, foreign monetary policy shock in the model, and we would like to highlight it compared to a demand shock. So basically, the idea is where's the a typical policymaker would ask, like, what is the consequence of raising interest rates abroad? That's the question that we're receiving. And now with the model that we had, we have to ask a question back, like, where's the interest rates raised? Where is the interest rate raise coming from? I mean, is it just an exogenous raise of interest rate, or is it an increase in foreign demand that is actually resulting in an increase of interest rates? And then we have completely different responses to the domestic economy. And that's why we think it was important to have the structural VAR in the model. So I try to present as quickly as possible what we changed in the model. I invite everyone to read the paper, and we're open for questions during the Q&A. Hoping to hear from Felipe now. Thank you.
Thanks, Angelo, for a very interesting presentation. Now the floor is to Mr.
His presentation.
Yeah. Now the floor is to Mr. Felipe from Richmond Fed. You're going to have 10 minutes to discuss Angelo's papers.
Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity to discuss this, very thoughtful work that you guys have done, and there's a lot to say. I'll try to focus my discussion on a few points here in the 10 minutes that I have. Before I start, I just wanted to kind of say a couple of things. I mean, one is, this morning I was reading Cochrane's discussion of Bob Lucas's work, and I think it's kind of interesting to kind of look at what you guys have done, because in a sense it's, I don't know exactly how Bob Lucas would kind of talk or just think about this model, but it's the kind of outgrowth of the challenge that he posed, to central banks and to economics about thinking about the economy in a way that is, takes agents' expectations and behavior in a serious way. And so it was kind of very interesting to reflect on that. The other thing I was going to say on kind of a more lighthearted note, I mean, I love, the acronym that you guys brought, and I couldn't resist, using this to build my presentation. So I hope you forgive me if it gets a little bit lighthearted at times. So, I'll start with a quote from a popular Brazilian song that says, "People who don't like samba cannot be a good person." It's one of our most characteristic musical genres. And it's more than 100 years old, and it has gone through all sorts of transformations and innovations. And I think it's fitting, that we have the Brazilian Central Bank calls it macro model samba, because it's, keeping it current and keeping it modern. It's kind of very sophisticated, like you know, like the samba song. You know, one of the many iterations of that was bossa nova, you know, translated to English roughly as a new groove. And, you know, Jobim, you could call him the Bob Lucas of Brazilian, you know, popular music. He was a master at using very high-powered machinery to tell very simple stories. So one of his very famous songs is the one-note samba. You know, every Brazilian, I think, knows that. You know, people who are not Brazilian, if they don't know what it is, you know, they just need to hang out in a Starbucks for long enough, and they might hear it, or, you know, in some kind of place. And you look at how the one-note samba is. I mean, you know, you have like on the top, it's like a single note, right? But here in the bottom, you know, all sorts of stuff is happening. The harmony is just moving around like crazy. I mean, Jobim was inspired by Debussy, right? So this is like super kind of sophisticated stuff. And then the rhythm, you know, this is a tablature for a guitar, also all over the place, like the samba one. So heavy machinery underlying it to tell a very simple story on the top, right? So I think this is something, you know, to keep in mind. So just summarizing the paper, it provides an update of the Samba model. You know, I think it's well written, and of course it's a 90-page paper, so there's a lot to kind of take in. And it deploys this kind of, you know, heavy machinery that modern macro has developed. You know, I kind of put these two main additions. There's much more that he just told us, but, you know, I think there's this labor market block with unemployment, so now they can bring in unemployment numbers, and then the much more detailed international block with more transmission channels, which I thought was kind of pretty neat, like the idea of like bringing the VAR. I'm not sure I've seen this elsewhere. You know, I kind of thought it was kind of very interesting. You know, so very briefly, labor market block, you know, that builds on papers with sticky wages. The workers have market power, and then they can be off their supply curves, and then you have something that looks like an involuntary unemployment you can try to match with data. And then international block, you know, it's a small open economy, so it makes sense to, rather than try to model the rest of the world like as a structural economy, you know, think of it as more exogenous with the VAR, which is more parsimonious, and then you sign restrictions so you can think about the different shocks. You know, but I think going back a little bit to Jobim and all the rest, I mean, I think in the end of the day, why do we like the SGE models relative to, say, VARs? It's because they serve as storytelling devices, right? So in economics, you know, they'll tell a story about some mechanism of how it works. In policy analysis, you know, we may want to think about historical decompositions. We can try to think about what different scenarios bring from counterfactual analysis. And, you know, these are kind of a way of like giving structured, you know, input into the policy process, right? You want to tell a story, but you want to make sure that your story is internally consistent, and that it kind of, you know, by kind of pushing in one direction, you're not kind of missing something else. And I think one thing that I would encourage you guys to do is kind of make it very clear how it is that the new features help you with these tasks, right? So if you compare the output that you get with the output from the older version, how it is that it changes, right? And what are the things that you can talk about? What are the stories you can tell that you couldn't tell before? So I focused on the historical decompositions. You know, this is GDP, right? And I think like the really big story that, you know, we want to think about is what happened in, you know, between 2015 and, you know, 2017. The model says it's supply shocks. You know, I think there's some plausibility to that. There was like a lot of subsidies and policies, industrial policy that happened during that period and that then had to unravel very quickly. But you know, in a model that's also kind of very reduced form, these are like productivity shocks, you know, so, but perhaps as the first approximation is not, you know, terrible. The other one, which I think is a little bit more problematic, is inflation. So, you know, the other very big, you know, event that happened in Brazil was like in the early 2000s, we had this big surge in inflation. And the model interprets that as having something to do with labor market frictions and perhaps like price markups. You know, I think that's a bit of a tougher sell, right? So, you know, people who have studied this, you know, they'll point to like spreads, international financial markets, or something to do with an anchoring of inflation expectations related to political cycles. By the way, I should have said in the beginning, I'm not representing the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. This is just me talking as, you know, an economist that also is Brazilian and, you know, cares about these things. But yeah, I mean, I think these are things worth thinking about. So what is missing? The model has a lot, right? But I think there are these policy shocks, and this is where my disclaimer is very important. These policy shocks are very important when we want to think about Brazilian business cycles. I understand this is a little bit, delicate, being the central bank, but I think it's hard also to escape, right? And I think having more in the model that allows you to think up through what these policy shocks do and how they affect things would be important, right? Now I'm going to go back to my Samba quote. Yeah, this is a good argument. Perhaps don't change the Samba so much. But I am going to suggest perhaps some changes, right? I mean, one is simple. In the estimation, I think you take like the inflation targets from the National Monetary Committee pretty seriously to kind of get, put discipline on your inflation target. Again, I can kind of see why you may want to do that. But, sometimes, you may worry that this is not quite what people are expecting. Brazil has amazing, expectations data. You guys already use it. But I kind of wonder whether this could be informative, especially now I think you guys have longer horizons as well that you can play with. Other things are more complicated, and I think there's less precedent from the literature, right? Thinking about the locative impact of credit in industrial policies and how they ebb and flow. How am I doing this time?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, I think I can make it. So labor market stories, you guys follow, I think there's like a well-established tradition of using sticky wages. I particularly don't love this way of modeling things. I think the labor market structure is very implausible, and I think ignores developments in macro labor. You could try to think about a labor search model, and that, has the advantage of bringing richer labor market data and policies into the model. You can look at gross flows, you can look at vacancy creation. It's also more work, it's also a more complicated model to work with. Something perhaps for the future. In Brazil, we had like important labor market reforms, right? So that would allow you to also be able to assess that. I'm gonna move, these are like smaller things and we can talk later. Another Samba quote, the Samba is the father of pleasure and is the son of pain. That's from Caetano Veloso. So all it has to say is much easier said than done. You guys went through a lot of pain to do this. And you did the hard part, and some of the extensions are straightforward or there's less so. But I think, it's a little bit of time to kind of have fun, right? And a little bit of pleasure and pick up and choose the stories and try to tell those stories. I'll let the Samba die, keep on the good work.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Felipe. Now, please go on and present your paper on multilateral co-movement in a new Keynesian world. A little trade goes a long way.
Okay, so thank you a lot to, including our paper here in the conference. It's a pleasure to be here and presenting this here. It's also kind of, it was interesting to kind of see Gita Gopinath's presentation yesterday because, in a sense, our paper is touching on these themes of international transmission, of shocks, and co-movement, right? I mean, it's very striking in the last year how much co-movement we've seen in output and in inflation across the country. So our paper, is an attempt to try to speak to this. We don't look at both pandemic data so directly. We have some kind of little exercise in the end, but, pre-pandemic already, you could see, a lot of co-movement in output, a lot of co-movement in inflation across countries. These are well-known facts. There's also kind of interesting cross-co-movement. So here we're looking at like 4 biggest economies plus Canada, just because we wanted to have, a big trade partner for the US. That is also a smaller economy. But if you look at the cross-co-movement, right, it's also like you see output growth in one country is correlated with inflation in other countries, which makes you think about a Phillips curve, which, it's kind of more global in sense, where, you have all these interactions. So I think like the question that, this kind of data suggests is like, when we see this co-movement, where is it coming from, right? Are we talking about global shocks? There's a pandemic, everyone gets affected, everyone reacted in the same way. Or are we thinking about spillovers? The Fed does some monetary policy, tightens, as they say, the US gets a cold, Brazil gets a pneumonia. We don't have Brazil here. It's not an emerging market paper so much. But, trying to get to that. And I think like our angle here is we want to look at that through trade, right? So a lot has been written about financial transmission. We want to look at trade transmission. I think that has been a little bit less of a focus, and in part because, especially when you look at these large economies, they tend to trade a lot with themselves, right? So about 80% of US output is really consumed inside the US. But there's still empirical work that would say, well, shocks in the US transmit, and we want to see what trade does. So what we want to do is we want to develop a tractable framework that is going to combine nominal rigidities and trade of goods and assets across multiple countries. And we're going to argue that that framework actually gives you a lot of co-movement. The framework, as I'm going to say and show, it's pretty tractable. It's basically, if you shut out trade, you get like a bunch of 3 equation New Keynesian models for each of the different countries. But then now we have a bunch of equations that tell us about capital flows and trade and, the other things that are important in an open economy. And yeah, as I mentioned, the trade spillovers are going to be important here in propagating the shock through the trade network. So how does that work? Say you have like some country or foreign country one, some expansionary monetary policy takes place there and consumption goes up. Well, then, workers have to work harder, their wages go up. Also, that country wants to consume more. Even if it has home bias, it still wants to buy more from abroad. So now it's kind of buying more from, 2 other foreign countries. And then the wages in those countries is going up, right? Now, those countries have their higher wages. That means, they're becoming less competitive, right? And it might be cheaper for them to buy some goods from home, the country that I'm calling the home country. Well, the country now is exporting more, it's producing more, their wages go up, it buys more from the foreign country, the first one, and then, you have the cycle, and then things feed on itself. Of course, everyone is trading with everyone, so I have a full matrix here, right? And these effects are kind of bouncing around and going back and forth in all sorts of directions. So how do we do this in a model, right? So we have a model, we have like a little diagram. The data have our diagram is a little bit smaller, but we have a bunch of workers in each country. They produce, some tradable intermediate inputs. These get traded across countries, kind of like Eaton and Kortum style trade models. And then they get purchased by this other layer of intermediate goods producers. And they are like alpha producers. So they buy these things, they assemble these things, and then, they produce some variety and they have some sticky prices. And then they sell these things at home as final goods. And then these can be split between, consumption, and we have some portfolio costs because we wanted to be able to play around with financial integration. So when you do that, you get a model with a bunch of equations that are actually, pretty nice in analytical terms and can be interpreted. So first you have like a set of 3 equations that look like the 3 equation model, New Keynesian model that many of you might be familiar with. Now, the key here is these are vectors, right? So here, this is the vector of consumption, the vector of interest rate, and each entry is a different country. So we have an IS curve that looks a lot like, IS curve is like an Euler equation essentially, right? We have a Phillips curve that here I wrote as a function of marginal cost as opposed to the output gap. And that's because we can't just write it as a function of the output gap. That's going to become clearer later. And a monetary policy rule that I'm going to leave unspecified, but think of a Taylor rule or something of the sort. And then we have 4 additional equations, right? So there's going to be an equation for the marginal costs, right? That comes into the Phillips curve. The key thing here is that marginal costs are now going to depend on wages all over the world, right? Because you're buying these goods from the different places, produced by these different workers, and then you're assembling them. And then this matrix here, var pi, we had a problem because pi is taken by inflation. So trade matrices are typically pi. Here we use the var pi. That's a matrix of import shares, right? So this is telling each country how much they're importing from other countries. If you import more from a country, you care more about the wages in that country. So that's pretty straightforward. Exchange rates also come in here. These are real exchange rates because you care about, you want to put everything in the same kind of unit. Now, the thing is wages, in a closed economy, they're just proportional to output because consumption and labor are the same. We don't have capital here like in, standard New Keynesian models. But here we have an open economy. So wages are actually a function of labor, right? Through the utility of labor, but also of consumption through wealth effects. So we need to keep track of these two things separately because they can be different here because we can run trade deficits. So what is a trade deficit? How is that determined? Well, there's a first direct thing, right? So consumption goes up, you in a country, you export to that country, so your output goes up, right? So this is the first element, size, a matrix of export shares now rather than import shares. But then you get substitution between countries because of relative price changes, right? So this is like the second term, the price elasticity that is going to come in there. And then there's like a relative price at that destination. Now, the key thing that comes out of the model, and this is something we found out as we solved it, is that when you think about this relative price, it's not just, the wage in one country versus the wage in another country, because you have to think about third country competitors, right? So, the US exports to Europe, the relevant thing is not just wages in Europe, but also wages in China, right? Because Europe is importing from China, and then Europeans are comparing not only, their own wages, but the wages of, China with the ones in the US. So this is kind of why you have this term there where you have both the import and the export matrix like multiplying each other. And this is picking up these third country effects. We have financial frictions in the model, because this is kind of what it takes to kind of get exchange rates to behave in a way which is reasonable or not reasonable the way exchange rates tend to be. So, if you don't have the orange bit, that's kind of what you get from a complete market setup, Backus and Smith. You consume more in a country where it's cheaper, right? But then we allow for these market frictions. We have an endogenous wedge. If you kind of have more capital flows, that affects like your cost of funds. And then we have portfolio shocks like Munkin and Itzcocky did. In the end of the day, I think when we estimate, that's going to dominate things more than the endogenous bit. The endogenous bit allows us to kind of think about financial autarky, so we kind of wanted that. And then we need a balance of payment just because, you need the capital flows to kind of go into the endogenous bit of the financial frictions, and capital flows and trade balance, they're kind of linked through, budget constraints essentially. So that's the model, right? I mean, in a sense, rather than 3 equations, we have 7. These are vector equations with matrices, but, each of these bits have a ready economic interpretation. It's kind of, easy to, I don't know how easy, but it's something that is understandable and you can play with. One thing you get is if you substitute out these terms into the Phillips curve, you get like a global Phillips curve, right? Where it makes clear that inflation in every country depends on output in all the other countries and consumption in all the other countries. Sometimes in like open economy, the SGE models, people would kind of use tricks to substitute out the consumption and the exchange rate and make something that looks like a Phillips curve with only output in it. Here we kind of leave it more general. We don't need to kind of make any assumptions about financial markets in order to derive this, for example. Oh, okay. Okay, I think I'm doing good then. I might be even a bit fast. So this is the global Phillips curve. Okay, so now let's get to the fun stuff, which is implications for cross-country movement. So one thing that we can do with this model is we can build a special case that we can solve in closed form. And that's going to give us positive cross-country correlation in output and inflation with uncorrelated demand shocks, right? And it kind of highlights, the trade spillovers. So the setup is we're going to use a simple forward-looking Taylor rule, right? So here's like interest rates depend on what expected inflation is. This has a feature that it ensures uniqueness of equilibrium if the phi is large enough, but at the same time, it makes interest rates, actual equilibrium interest rates, nominal interest rates, IID, and also consumption. So this is going to give us IID consumption across countries and over time. So we're kind of starting from that completely uncorrelated thing, right? We're going to assume perfect capital market. Like I said, I think that's also kind of closer to the relevant case, when we estimate the model. And we have a proposition, where basically we say, output, right, in each of the different countries is going to be this linear function of consumption, right? Where we have this matrix, this AYY inverse, which looks like a Leontief inverse, in a sense that, you have like this, adding rounds of influence that are happening through the trade network. And then inflation depends on output. So you're going to get co-movement in output, through this AYY inverse matrix, right? And then that co-movement in output is going to generate co-movement in inflation over and above what you get naturally just from the fact that you have the direct spillovers through imports, right? So you get co-movement in inflation because of co-movement in output. Let me tell you a little bit more about the co-movement in output. So, this AYY inverse, you can think of as like a geometric sum of like, matrices that are just like taking powers of them, bigger and bigger powers, right? And, you can decompose it. There's like direct effects, right? So remember, if you remember, this has been going kind of quickly, in a trade equation, right? There's a direct effect of like a consumption shock on trade through exports. So that's the psi, right? That's kind of like the export matrix, right? That's kind of the shock, and that has a direct impact on output. But then you have these indirect effects, right? And these are taking place through these changes in relative prices, right? And that are making trade move around. So here you see the psi times var pi, that's picking up, these kind of third country effects and what they're doing. And then, this coefficient B here, that tells you how slowly this thing converges, right? It depends on the trade elasticity, right? So if you have more trade elasticity, that means, trade is moving around more and things are being distributed across countries more. And it depends on the inverse of the labor supply elasticity, right? If wages react more, you get more of this kind of redistribution here of output across countries. So, this is kind of how this is taking place. And then this can add up in a way that, you go from a matrix which is pretty diagonal to something which is like very not diagonal. We can also look at other shocks in the special case. So one thing that is interesting here is you think about TFP shocks as like something that affects only TFP levels. It's like an IID growth rate shock. In this framework, they do nothing. They do nothing. They are going to affect output in the country, but they don't spill over. And that's because, exchange rates are going to move in just the right way. The model is written in a way where everything is kind of, detrended by output, and you have like a balanced growth path. So if you just kind of increase the level of output for one country, that doesn't affect how the other countries are relative to their own productivity levels. So this kind of, it's interesting because, there's other paper by Huo, Pandalai Nayar and Levchenko, where, they try to generate co-movement through trade with TFP shocks and they have trouble. Their paper is much more subtle and sophisticated than that, but, I thought it was interesting. Markup shocks don't do a whole lot here because, basically you're only affecting inflation and you don't have the direct feedback from inflation to, monetary policy. Just in this very simple analytical, we're going to have this in a quantitative model. Also, persistence and all of that will kind of matter. Okay, so this is the simple analytical model. It was nice. We could look at some equations. Now we're going to, allow for persistence in shocks. We're going to allow for Taylor rule, which, reacts to current inflation. And we're going to do a Bayesian estimation using sequential Monte Carlo. So I felt like very current looking at your paper, even if it's really my co-author who was doing the hard work there. So what we do is, we're interested in this decomposition of like common shocks versus idiosyncratic shocks. So we kind of, have the different shocks and we allow them to have like a common component, like a global factor, and then like country-specific components. We use data on GDP growth, exchange rate, inflation, and nominal interest rates, and then we have, shocks to TFP growth, markups, monetary policy, and then what we call financial, it's really like this wedge in the exchange rate, like Itzcock and Mukin. Everything is AR1, so there's like persistence everywhere. And then we could, go back to our question, right? I mean, what drives cross-country correlations? And the way we do it is you do the model, you get the historical decomposition, you feed that in the model, and then you start doing counterfactuals, right, to kind of shut down channels. So one thing you can do is like you shut down trade, right? So you shut down trade, and then you're going to lose about 50%, about half of the movement in output, and inflation. The other thing you can do is you shut down the global factors, and then you find out that if you do that, actually you keep most of the output correlations, right? So trade is doing quite a bit here. We can also look at propagation channels. So one thing to we talked about indirect channels, right? I mean, through like changes in prices. So how do you shut that down? You make that price elasticity small, right? So bring it to 1 rather than what we estimate, which I think is closer to the trade estimates. And then you do that, and you lose a lot of the movement. The other thing you can do is, if you take out price stickiness, make frequency of price changes very high. That also does away with a lot of movement. It makes sense if you think in terms of like the analytical model, where it was really like this kind of very demand-driven thing, right? And then financial autarky, also seems to matter. So if you shut down, capital flows completely, that also kind of takes away a lot of the movement. So the last thing I'm going to do here is just like a little, counterfactual exercises or really impulse response functions. So one question is, what happens if you have like an inflationary shock in Europe, right? How does that affect the US? So, there's a war in Ukraine, European economy gets affected in a lot of ways. I'm sitting in the US at the Fed, and we're kind of thinking, okay, how do we think about this as far as like our inflation and output? So we do like a markup shock in Europe. And we think about something that generates like a 3/4% rise in European, or sorry, 3 to 4% rise in European inflation between 2021 and 2022, right? And we get that about half of that gets transmitted to the U.S., right? The red line is what happens if you shut down, the spillovers through trade. Thank you. The other thing we do is the contractionary monetary policy in the U.S. And then here you can really see the movement is like, you get like an output hit in most countries, and also inflation. So, it seems like a little trade could go a long way, which is the point here. So, conclude, incorporate multilateral trade and nominal rigidities. We get this network effect that amplifies the spillovers. The model implies this global Phillips curve that tells you exactly, the different channels. And, it seems to make some quantitative, to have some quantitative oomph to it. Thank you.
Thanks again, Felipe. Thanks again, Felipe. And now let's invite Mr. Afonso from Nova School of Business and Economics to share his thoughts on Felipe's paper.
Okay, so thanks for having me here discussing this paper. It's basically a beautiful paper, and I won't have much to say on the model itself. But what I'll try to do is to bring a bit this analysis to empirical literature. How can we think about this empirically? And then some comments, but I mean, just some comments on the model, but on extensions that we can think about. So just a quick overview of the paper. Basically, the data tells us that inflation and output, and also inflation and output across countries, co-move together. and tries to explain this. So is this coming from common factors? Is this coming from trade? Let's isolate the two things. First of all, it's really a timely question. So we have been having a couple of shocks, either monetary policy shocks, markup shocks, inflationary shocks across the world. How does that affect and spill over to other countries? Basically, it focuses on 5 countries, advanced economies, but I think it's really a useful framework to think also on how does other shocks or foreign shocks affect emerging economies. So at the end of the day, the contribution is that indirect trade. So trade through indirect effects, what they call third country effects, can go a long way in explaining these movements on inflation output and between inflation and output across countries. Again, it's really a nice paper built in a way that it's really useful. It's building a framework to think about the global Phillips curve, and again, really timely. So what I'll try to do now is try to compare this framework and how do you think about this, or how could we think about this in empirical estimates. I thought of doing a couple of things, but then I found some papers that I think we can think about them and this paper, this theoretical paper together. Then some comments, but small comments, both on the size of the IRFs, to think a bit about the consumption puzzle, which I don't know, we could think about it together a bit, and then just some open questions for monetary policy. You also have it on the paper, but I really see the paper as a perfect framework to think about how should we change or at least adapt monetary policy in this trade important world. Just one slide summarizing again the model. It joins nominal rigidities with trade, and basically with that we get that marginal costs in a given country are not only a function of their wages, but wages abroad. So not only wages, but exchange rates in the trading partners. And with that, we get a direct effect on the trade balance, which is consumption from other countries. That's direct, and an indirect one that comes from marginal costs and wages abroad and not in our own economy. So with that, we get the global Phillips curve, and we see that output and marginal costs abroad have a direct impact on inflation in a given country, and with that, we'll link everything through this global Phillips curve. So let's connect a bit this with the empirical evidence. First of all, we have a bunch of empirical evidence that shows us that, for example, US monetary policy shocks have substantial spillovers to other countries, especially for emerging economies. And consistent with this trade story, we have also evidence that shows that this is more important. So other economies and other blocks respond more to US shocks than the other way around. And the US usually doesn't import as much as, for example, the euro area. And so this is consistent with the trade story that the paper tries to tell. So what I want to explore further is that there are still evidence that these global factors are really important in the empirical evidence. I'm going to focus on two papers and how could we think about this in the model or incorporate in the model. First one basically looks at multi-country and industrial level data, and while they find that purely global shocks don't matter that much for production price index movements across countries, they find that sectoral shocks, and the important part here is that they define sectoral shocks as shocks to a specific country, but that happen to all the economies, are really driving the movement and in prices across countries. They still find, of course, that then input-output linkages and trade amplifies all of this, but this common shocks to all countries, but to specific sectors, really matter for co-movement. So what are the implications for the model? Should we have more than one sector and think about these global shocks, but across sectors and not across the whole economy? how could we extend this and think about this. Second one is basically assessing again the impact that monetary policy shocks in the US have on the other economies. But the part that I want to highlight here, and I think it's important, is that they find the commodity and oil price channel, they call it this way, that really explains and really drives a lot the response of nominal variables, CPI, in other economies to monetary policy shock. So the mechanism for this is basically that what starts as a country shock, a monetary policy shock in the US, lowers world demand. So this is the trade effect that you highlight, and it's clearly there. But then that creates basically a global shock that spreads through oil and commodity prices. And then the movement in CPI and in inflation across countries is driven by this global shock that this is a consequence of the country shock. So it's basically as if this channel is present, can we really shut down the global shocks in your model and think only about trade isolated? Because if this channel is there, then trade is also driving the global shocks. And so it's not obvious how can we isolate this. Or maybe we could also extend, or you could also extend the model and try some feedback on the structural, on the shock structure to capture this channel. Okay, so these are basically the most important comments that I have and things that that I think are important to think about. These are minor comments on the quantitative results. The first one is on the consumption puzzle. So through the mechanism described in the markup exercise, it seems that to have a negative consumption co-movement as you have in your model, it would have to be that the response of the central bank in the second country would be having a higher importance on the mechanism than the trade in the first place. Otherwise, consumption in the two countries will move as output does. So how can we also think about this consumption puzzle and try to solve it, let's put it this way. Second thing is on the magnitude of the IRFs itself. So the first thing is that when you simulate the monetary policy shock in the US, the responses of output are not that different. I mean, they are, but the difference is not striking from the US GDP response and the other countries, while the response of inflation is completely different. So this difference, should we expect such a difference? Of course, we should expect some, and you show in the data that GDP could move more than inflation, but the magnitude struck me a bit. And even so, the response by itself of inflation in the US, it's almost minus 3.3% at impact after 25 basis points in monetary policy shock. So it struck me as being a bit too big, but again, it's minor comments and just to think about this. I'm going to wrap up. So last thing, and again, you have this on paper, so I'm not going to go into much detail of this. It's an open question, but I really think about this model as a perfect tool to think about different monetary policy rules. Should monetary policy be purely inward-looking? Should it incorporate third country effect? Should it anticipate shocks in other countries? So I think this is a perfect framework to think about these questions, but you already raised these questions on the paper, so just emphasizing them. Okay, so basically to conclude, very interesting paper. I think that it builds a great framework to think about co-movement and shocks in other countries and how do they spill over to other economies. I think it is partially aligned with empirical evidence, but also there is empirical evidence showing that we cannot really split global factors and global shocks from country-specific shocks, especially if they come from the US. So how do we think about this in the paper? And again, great framework to further think about optimal monetary policy. And that's it. Thanks. Okay, let's get it.
Thanks, Afonso. Please, for the discussion, please go on and present your paper, which is short and variable lags.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to present a paper which is entitled Short and Variable Lags. We have a bunch of co-authors. We are 10 co-authors. Never saw a paper in economics with as many co-authors as this, but it's trying to work with Buda, Carvalho, Corsetti, Duarte, Anson, me, Ortiz, Rodrigo, Mora, and Silva. So as the name says, or as you can imagine, short and variable lags are basically challenging the common view that it takes a lot of time to monetary policy to affect the economy. This long and variable lags view comes from Friedman, and it's perfectly ingrained in the minds of academics and policymakers. We always think about monetary policy as having long and variable lags, and it takes quite some time to affect real variables. I have here a quote from Powell at the beginning of February, precisely stating this, that they are taking into consideration the long and variable lags and thinking about that when designing monetary policy. But we don't need to go that far. Yesterday, Gita, when she gave the opening speech, I took note. She mentioned that monetary policy takes long and variable lags to impact the economy. So you can see that academics and policymakers think with this long and variable lag in their heads. So what we try to do in this paper is to challenge this view and basically show you that even if the bulk of monetary policy works with long and variable lags, it doesn't rule out the possibility of also working and also significantly impacting the economy at short lags. How can we look at this now? And we haven't looked at this before, because now we have much more high frequency data that allows us to precisely look at these short lags. It allows us to precisely assess the exact frequency at which monetary policy operates. It basically allows us to look at different lags across different heterogeneous real variables in the economy. Do they take the same time to respond, or some of them take more than others? And then we also do an exercise in which we aggregate the data into a lower frequency and we see if that has some impact in the previous findings that it takes a lot of time for the monetary policy to affect the economy. Before I give you a preview of our results, let me just tell you that this short lags view is already in the literature. The point is that the thing is that these papers weren't exactly looking at this question, but if we take a look at the IRFs and the responses that they have there is some significant impact response at impact, so short lags. We have papers that already find this at the economic activity. Then we have housing prices and mortgage rates. We have evidence that they respond within weeks, 1 or 2 weeks after the shock. Housing prices and mortgage rates are already responsive to monetary policy. Financial markets basically instantaneously respond to monetary policy shocks. We also have that public confidence about the state of the economy instantaneously responds to monetary policy shocks. And more recently, we also have papers using credit card data and showing that the responses of consumption, for example, are fast. So what do we find? We basically quantify these responses at a really high frequency, using really high frequency data. We show that aggregate consumption, corporate sales and employment start to decline in a matter of days after monetary policy shock. We do, within this setting, we perform an exercise in which we aggregate the variables into a lower frequency and show that hides and masks the short lags. If we were to do the same analysis, but only using lower frequency variables, we wouldn't find the short lags. And then we also show you some heterogeneity across different variables and across different categories of consumption and sales. and sectors of activity in these responses. Okay, let me start by telling you the data that we use. So for aggregate consumption, we use daily consumption data that comes from bank transaction data in Spain. It basically puts together all the means of payments that are available for a customer at this bank. So it doesn't use only card transaction data. It uses all the means of payments. It's basically a counterpart it's the daily counterpart of the quarterly version of Buda and co-authors that they basically build this data set at the quarterly frequency to match the national accounting consumption data in Spain, and they show that they perfectly correlate with national accounting data. We are just using the daily counterpart of that data. And it goes from the beginning of April 2015 until the end of 2021. Now for sales, we're going to grab Spanish tax authority data. So the Spanish tax authority forces the largest firms in the country to report daily the amount of VIT that they collected, and with that we can extrapolate basically the amount of sales that companies did at the daily basis. And this data set covers more or less 70% of the domestic sales in Spain. Okay, so it's a gross output measure in the sense that it incorporates sales to Spanish households and tourists, but also investment goods sales and intermediate goods sales to other firms. Okay, this data is only available from July 2017 to the end of 2021 as well. Now for employment, we also have the Social Security in Spain reporting at the daily basis the amount of active contracts that they have registered at the Social Security. So it basically nets out any new contract in a given day from any contract that was destroyed in a given day. So we have the amount of active labor contracts in the Social Security system. Of course, this is not all the employment, but the ones that are official and registered as the Social Security we have. So again, goes from 2015 to 2021. Now, the monetary policy shocks. We use state-of-the-art identification of monetary policy shocks. We borrow from the literature the shocks that are identified within a small window of monetary policy announcements. We focus on 1-year yield changes so that we basically capture a bit of all the monetary policy toolkit around this period. So not only focusing on short interest rates shocks, but also trying to capture a bit of forward guidance and quantitative easing. We also control for the central bank information channel. So a concern that's been around for quite some time in the literature. We control by using sign restrictions as in the literature. And with that, we get what we call pure monetary policy shocks, not contaminated by the central bank information channel. Then basically we just run local projections and get the IRFs from these local projections. Two small notes that are worth mentioning. So first of all, with daily data, of course, we get a lot of noisy fluctuations. So the way we deal with that is we look at the variables taking 90 days moving average, but this is robust to taking different number of days into account. And then to try to deal with seasonality, we use the variables as their year-on-year growth rates. Okay, so we compute these local projections using these variables in year-on-year growth rates. But then for the IRFs, we recover from these year-on-year changes the level changes in the variables. We have the COVID period in our sample. We have to include it because otherwise we only have a couple of years to do the analysis. So to control for this, we use the stringency index, and we also use the number of cases that were reported in Spain. Again, robustness checks show that including this or other controls don't change that much the results. And here we have it, the first result for consumption. So basically what we see, so we have on the left panel, we have the IRFs for 2 years, 60 more than 660 days. And on the right panel, we zoom in on the first 31 days. So what we see is that within 5 days, the consumption response is already significant. So it's quite fast consumption responding to a monetary policy shock. This is significant at the 95% level. Again, let me emphasize that these short lags, this right panel that zooms in the first 31 days and shows that short lags are present, doesn't rule out the story that monetary policy fully unveils at longer horizons. If you see on the left panel, the more persistent and more persistent decline in consumption still happens around 1 year after the shock. So the long lags are still there. So we're not saying that the long lag story is wrong. We're just bringing the short lag story into the picture. For sales, we have more or less the same behavior, but it takes slightly more time for sales to respond. So the significant response only starts like after 30 days after the shock. But once it's significant, it's deeper. It's a deeper response than consumption. We argue that this is not totally unexpected. We know from the literature that investment goods and intermediates are more fluctuate more than other types of good consumption. So when we have this sales significant negative response, it's actually deeper than the consumption response that we had in the previous slide. For unemployment, we also find that employment starts to contract in a matter of days. Of course, if you see the left panel, it's not the first 31 days, it's not actually an economic significant response, but it's statistical significant. It's much smoother, much more persistent, and it builds really after only 420 days. But still, it's detected. We can detect it within a matter of days. So basically, this first exercise shows that we have both short and long lags in the transmission of monetary policy. The series align at the long lags, so basically the short lag story doesn't rule out the long lag story. There is some heterogeneity across these 3 different variables, and we're going to see that there is going to be also within sales and within consumption a lot of heterogeneity. We've raised some questions. So this paper is written as a short paper, so we don't look at them really in deep, but we raise some questions there. So why do we have an employment that it's much stickier and it takes much more time to build? Are there labor market frictions that we should consider? Those kind of things that we can think about when we look at these IRFs. Now, the second exercise that we think it's really important is to show you that if we were to do this exercise but using a lower frequency, so if we grab this daily frequency data and aggregate it into a monthly or quarterly frequency, we lose some of the identification of the short lags. For monthly data, it doesn't matter too much, but for the quarterly data, what the graphs show you, I hope you can see it, but what the quarterly data exercise show you is the aggregated IRFs. So we grab the IRFs at the daily frequency and we aggregate them into a quarterly frequency, compared to the exercise in which first we aggregate the data into a quarterly frequency and then we run the IRFs. And we see that this second exercise shifts the information to longer lags. It takes more or less 2 or 3 quarters to all of the variables to show a significant response. So basically, we find this as evidence, or at least in this setting, we find this as evidence that at least part of the time of at least part of the long and variable lag story may come or is a byproduct of time aggregation and using lower frequency data. Final exercise that we have on the paper is to show you that even at the daily base, we find the common heterogeneous responses within consumption and sales that we already have at lower frequency data in other papers. So we see that all the bulk of the consumption response is coming from the response of durable and luxury goods. So those are the categories that really contract after a monetary policy shock. Consumption commitments and necessities basically don't respond to monetary policy shock. So it's really the durable goods and the luxury goods that drive this fast response in consumption. For sales, it's going to be more or less the same. So sectors that are close to final demand, textile, electronics, trade react much faster, and upstream sectors such as construction sectors or energy take much more time to respond and drive the slower response of aggregate sales. This is not new, so the literature shows this already, that consumption is driven by durable goods, or the response of consumption to monetary policy shocks is driven by durable goods. We just show that this still holds at the daily frequency, and for sectors, for sales, it's also interesting to see that the downstream sectors close to final demand also drive the fast response. Sectors that are on the upstream side of the supply chain basically don't respond as fast as the other sectors. Okay, so those are the main results that we have on the paper. Then on the appendix, we have a couple of robustness. So again, this short lag story kind of challenges our priors. So we have to show you that this still holds if we use different variables and different applications. So what we do is with industrial production, we try to see if the results are still there for the same time period. If we compare the industrial production exercises with monthly consumption and monthly sales, IRFs are basically the same or pretty similar. Short and long lags are there. With industrial production, we can exclude the COVID period because we can go further back in time. And if we run the exercise using a sample from 2000 to 2019, we see that the short lags on the IP are still detectable. So at impact, industrial production contracts after a monetary policy shock. We do the same thing for retail. For the same time period, the same thing. The IRF is more or less the same. And if we run the regression excluding the COVID period at the 68 confidence interval, we also see that retail responds significantly to a monetary policy shock. So this tries to give us a bit of external validity in the sense that we're looking at different indicators now. The other external validity exercise that we try to do is to do this, but for another country. The German Bundesbank compiles a weekly activity indicator, and basically we do this exercise using this weekly activity indicator, and we see that the responses are there. The short lags and the long lags are basically there as well. So this is robust to applying it to a different constant context and a different country. Okay, I think I'll wrap up. So basically what we do here is we look at high frequency data and ask how can we, by using this high frequency data, look at the impacts of monetary policy shock, focusing on different time horizons that the literature hasn't done before. And with this high frequency data, we can explore really disaggregated level and layers of the variables. Our findings are basically that monetary policy shock has promptly impact on economic activity. Different variables respond in different ways, but both the three variables that we look into the paper show short lags in responding to monetary policy shock. Again, this doesn't rule out the story that monetary policy fully unveils itself at the long lags. Long lags are still there, even if we use the daily data. We bring into the picture the story of the short lags. Then, just to conclude, mentioning the two other exercises, time aggregation may have something to do with the common story that it takes a lot of time for monetary policy to affect the economy. We show that if we aggregate the data into a lower frequency, that affects our responses and shifts the information to longer horizons. And again, even at a daily frequency, there is a lot of heterogeneity among consumption and sales categories in the response. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Afonso. Now we go to Angelo's comments on your paper.
First, I'd like to thank Afonso for a great presentation. I'd like to say that, again, these are my opinions. It's not the opinion of the institution. This is just, and neither from the authors of the Samba paper, it's just my opinions here. So, first of all, I'd like to say very, very, very nice paper. Love reading it. The idea of using very high frequency data set was really, really amazing to read it, especially for me that I'm not from the field, gotta say it in advance, like handling this type of data sets. It was very interesting for me. The idea of building a data set that actually talks or at least is consistent with conventional statistical methodologies for computing the national accounts is like a huge effort. We can basically, there's an entire paper, as I understood, there's an entire paper describing this, how to build that data set. So it was very, very interesting. And the idea of using monetary policy shocks, this is something that we are seeing a lot in the literature, the estimation of these monetary policy shocks, and then bring it to these data sets is also very, very interesting. So what I'd like to talk first is that, so there are just small details. I think the paper is great, but there are some small issues that I think you could basically, at the end of the day, just leverage the usage of the data set to try to tell more stories. That's what I found missing in a sense, because in terms of the technique, just like some small details, I mean, what I'm showing here is your first picture, the impact on consumption on the left, and on the right is the same impact. You aggregated the consumption, sales, and employment figures in one graph, but consumption is right there for the 30-day moving average. And because you mentioned at first that you had a lot of noise in your consumption data, so you smooth using the 90 days moving average. And in the robustness check, and this is one of the things that I found really, really cool in the paper, is that the more robustness check that was running, the more the results really look the same, which is, of course, good. So, so given that the results are pretty much the same, irrespective of the size of the window that you are using your moving average, so why don't you stick to the smallest moving average? So this is something that was sort of troubling. I mean, if the results are the same, why do you need the 90-day moving average? And in terms of how much of information you're trying to throw away, and in this next slide, let's just think that try to gather some proportions on how much volatility you are actually just throwing away. I mean, if you take a random sample from a Gaussian, standard Gaussian distribution and compute the moving average, what do you get in terms of standard deviations of the noisy data compared to using a moving average of 30 days and then of 30 periods and then of 90 periods? So if you compare the two standard deviations of the moving average from this incredibly simple process, you are pretty much just throwing away half of the volatility of your data. And if you have the same results, I mean, that would be a point in favor actually of your model if you reduce the window to 30 days. In terms of what I was saying at first, in terms of leveraging the data, there's absolutely a common pattern. I mean, once you start reading the robustness tests that are presented in the appendix and start comparing the figures, I mean, they really look almost the same. And there is this pattern of an almost immediate impact on consumption around 5 days with a decline until 90 days after the shock. Then there's this recovery between 90 and 150 days, a new drop after 180 to 360, and a very slow recovery from 360 to 500 days. And then when I started comparing the responses, both the baseline and the robustness checks, I was looking for a story there. Of course, you told us about the luxury goods and the durable goods, but there's exactly the figure that you showed sort of sticking to my head, the aggregate and sectoral results, where you have those 5 sectors where the simulations are pretty much the same. They follow the same pattern, but not only they follow the same pattern, but they also have almost the same magnitudes during the first drop, then the recovery, then the new drop. So point is this something, a feature of your estimation procedure that actually replicates when you start disaggregating your data? So it's something from the methodology that you are actually using, or is there a story that you can actually leverage, disaggregating further your data to improve the story that you are telling? Because we can easily tell, given those sectors, I mean, clothing, recreation, restaurants, and transport, you can easily tell a story of why you are cutting that and why these lags show up. But given that they are so similar, they are so they are almost the same visually. Looking at that, is there something else that you can leverage, looking at your data, looking at further levels of disaggregation in order to tell a story here? So this is pretty much my suggestion. Of course, you said that for education that you also get this result, that there's a full discussion about why education you might have this type of behavior. You have the idea, as I mentioned, the cut the spending on luxury and durable goods. That's a nice story. But why do we have the second round? Why do you have a recovery? Are we talking about maybe you could cross-check the information from employment to the information on consumption, and then basically tell a story that, okay, we have a second round of reduction in consumption because people started losing jobs or something like that, those cross correlation across data sets and within each data set. So that's what I was pretty much missing. I mean, you had a tremendous methodological application to that nice, very nice data set, but I was missing the storytelling. That's pretty much the idea here of my comments. Again, terrific paper, love reading, love it, the amount of robustness checks that you actually run, but I was missing the storytelling at the end of the day. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Angelo. Now we have 10 minutes for the audience, but if you would like to give some comments on the comments that you received as well, feel free.
Starts.
Maybe we start with the order that we presented. Yeah.
Okay. So just taking a look at the comments. Thank you, Felipe, for your great comments on the new features versus the results. Yes, we think that's something that we have to explore. We received a similar comment a few days ago, and that's the whole plan of the work with the model. Now that we have this baseline, this paper as a baseline, is to start exploring like how the model is different from the different feature and exploring in details small pieces that we put together in that paper. In terms of the GDP 2015, 2018 that you mentioned that you were worried about that productivity shock, that's pretty much okay. We have the story about the crisis, but the issue is that prolonged up until the end of the sample 2019, where pretty much the economic crisis from 15-16 was almost done. So we believe that the model right there is capturing a change in the trend that we could not adjust on data. So there was, for some reason that we cannot actually truly specify why, a change in the growth rate of the economy, the long run growth rate. That's what pretty much the model is capturing there in terms of the non-stationary productivity shocks. In terms of the unemployment, we definitely have to take a look at that in around 2003. But yeah. One of the issues that you mentioned, okay, that was a policy crisis. That was in 2003. This is something that we are not entirely comfortable with the model. We think that's one of the extensions that we might actually look at, which is the absence of a financial accelerator with an explicit risk premium to be modeled, a domestic risk premium to be modeled, because that was a domestic crisis mostly, and also during 2014, 2015. So that's one of the ways that we are thinking later to improve the model, and then putting all these pieces together. I mean, when we mentioned in the paper the decomposition of the 2008, the great financial crisis, we mentioned, okay, we sell the story that it's a lot of negative investment shocks, but once we have a financial accelerator, we think that we can improve there, and also the description of the evolution of the economy in those crises. In terms of the inflation target using the long focus, that's what other central banks do. That's a very interesting idea. I think we should definitely take a look at that. And in terms of other structures for labor markets, that's one of the extensions that we plan, like writing smaller papers, but referencing to that. So thank you very much for your comments.
So I'm gonna now answer to the comments here. I'll try to keep it very short so we can give the audience also a chance to make questions. Thanks a lot. I mean, I think this is very helpful stuff. I mean, one of the things about the model that we like is that I think it's relatively simple. So it's kind of, it shouldn't be too hard to kind of add extensions to it. And I think the commodity channel, I think, is something worth thinking about. I mean, in a sense, yeah, the decomposition is all model driven, right? So it's like we're asking, given the trade model that we have, how much is spillovers, how much is global? In order to answer your question, the right thing to do would be to have a commodity sector and do it. I mean, we've been getting a lot of comments also from trade people, especially. They're really keen on the whole supply chain thing. So this is something we may need to kind of think about for a revision. And yeah, the upper monetary, I think this is something that's been a little bit on my mind. We haven't really done it. I wonder if this paper or another paper, but I think it's absolutely something that, I think that the framework, should lend itself to. We can talk more about the other things. I mean, this is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief as well. So on the 30-day, 90-day moving average thing, you're right. There's no particular, I think we try to be conservative in the first place, and we tried like 1 quarter moving average, but if it works on the 30-day, I don't see, at least it doesn't come up any good reason to not want to use it 30 days, so you're right on that. The second thing, so the story behind all of this, and especially behind the second throw, again, we try not to go too deep into questions we won't be able to answer. So again, the paper is written as a short paper, is just to give you this new intuition, but then we cannot really go that deep into the storytelling. I think that the rebound of income, and especially because we see that the response of employment, while fast, statistically fast, but delayed in the sense that it takes a lot of time to build, and it takes more than I don't know, 400 days to really decline. Maybe that's the consequence. The second rebound, it's precisely the consequence that employment only falls after 1 year or something like that. But we could think about that and try to explore it more. We have some exercises that we have been running to try to get some more intuition, but we have to look at it, and I think that's really a good comment and something to have in mind. Thank you.
Thanks. We still have some time for a couple of questions. Please be brief. We'll still have after this a break of 20 minutes break, so you can ask as much as you want during this time or during lunchtime, okay? Anybody from the audience? We go, so Clássius and João.
So very nice presentations. I'll be brief. On Felipe's paper, is it the trade channel in part a finance channel? Because we know the trade finance is a very volatile part of the financial sector, and that often gives also a global spillover, which can in part be the dollar in some sense as a proxy for financial tightening. So we found some evidence, at least at the BS, that channel is not unimportant, that the trade finance is being cut back, which then leads to the trade spillovers. Just a comment. And I have the same question on, it's very intriguing, Alfonso, what you presented in terms of the lag structure, what Angela also pointed out. Have you tried kind of an IO view over this? I mean, is there sectoral linkages and then feedback effects where certain sectors have either upstream or downstream things that can explain some of these patterns?
Answer, wait for the other question. Okay. I think that's a great comment. I mean, I've worked with inventories before in other work that I've done. And yeah, I mean, I think this is a very interesting thing to think about. We haven't really thought, so it's written down and I'll talk to my co-authors about it.
Again, useful way of think. I mean, we didn't go that deep into trying to explain this. We just found it interesting that sales follow basically what consumption is telling us. But of course, there are many stories that can be lying behind of this. We didn't go that deep in the paper, but of course, in future research, we have to understand better exactly what drives everything, and exploring that mechanisms would be on top of the table. Thank you.
Hi, for Felipe, a great paper. I'm looking forward to read it actually, from the presentation. And my question is, first a clarification, how much parameter heterogeneity there is in your estimation, and if you find it reasonable. And because another one is that 40%, 50% of the correlation seems like a large number, but it's conditional on the model being right? The causal relations need to be the actual ones. And so it would be interesting to think so to look for natural events like the pandemic, for instance, where you have supply disruptions that change the coefficients by a lot, and to see how it would impact the correlations, and if you have this effect. So more like a suggestion.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, this is very well taken. We do allow for quite a bit of heterogeneity in the parameters, in the estimation. It's not something we highlight, I don't think, in terms of like the mechanisms that we kind of identify the heterogeneity in parameters as, something that is particularly important, although people have asked that to us in the past already, so perhaps we should like do some exercise to like look into what this might be doing. And yeah, I mean, I think, the model is limited to what it can do, right? And I mean, I think there's like a million, there are many interesting things that it doesn't encompass that we could think of. So it's a bit of a proof of concept in a sense. It's like how far you can go in a realistic way. Thinking about a natural event, yeah, I mean, the pandemic is hard because there's so much stuff going on. But, perhaps we can think of something else we can do. I think it would be interesting for sure.
So thanks again. I think it's time to part. We will join in 20 minutes.